Well, today we have a returning guest, someone that many of you are always keen to hear from because it's so hard to get any facts that are pretty brutally sticking to the objective reality of what's going on in the Ukraine war. And today, Colonel Douglas Macgregor returns. How you doing, sir?
Great, thanks, dude.
Now, I wanted to bring you on because there's been some big developments that we've heard in the news. We've heard of things like Bakhmut has now been completely, conquered by the Russians. It appears. We've also heard recently about these kamikaze drones striking close to Moscow, which the media is saying has rattled the folks, the Muscovites in that city. The war's coming closer to home for them. How do you see where things stand now with kind of those two things as the backdrop, and anything else that you'd like to?
Well, as a general observation, and this is, I think, very important for Americans to understand, I think we've reached a point in this conflict and crisis that is probably more dangerous than it has ever been, certainly since 22 February, and perhaps the most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have an unwillingness in Washington and its closest allies in Western Europe to really talk to the Russians, to find a way to end this tragedy in Ukraine, to stop the complete destruction of the Ukrainian state and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. There's just no willingness to do it. And the Russians are now confronting the reality that since we are unwilling to negotiate, that not only will they have to continue to press this war to the finish, but they may actually have to mobilize the nation to go to war. And I think these things are points that Americans are not hearing about. Now, you mentioned two things. One was Bakhmut. Well, Bakhmut was essentially a trap that the Russians set for the Ukrainians. It was always Zelensky who kept insisting that Bakhmut was not just another town on the map. It was a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. It was also a hub for transportation and logistics. Therefore, the Ukrainians had to fight and win it. When the Russians discovered that, and I would say they became pretty convinced that this was an obsession with the Ukrainians in December of last year, they decided to go ahead and let as many Ukrainians as possible march into the trap. So in the meantime, they've killed at least 50,000 Ukrainians involved with Bakhmut and probably wounded at least that many or more, just as a result of the Bakhmut operation. I think when it became clear that the Ukrainians were no longer going to reinforce failure, the Russians decided to close it off, which is what they've done. They finally moved in, eradicated the last bit of resistance, and have now prepared this front of several hundred miles in southern Ukraine for Ukraine's widely announced and heralded counterattack. Now, as far as the drone strikes on the Kremlin are concerned, we're not sure how many were originally launched. Somebody said 19, perhaps 20, 25, doesn't make any difference. It looks as though 3 of them got through the integrated air defenses, at least close enough to fall to the ground within, let us say, a kilometer or two of Putin's private residence. And it seems pretty clear that they were trying to target his residence. Excuse me. And I think that's pretty clear evidence that we provided them with the data and the trajectory. I think the drones themselves were probably launched from inside Russia. And people frequently say, well, what's wrong with the Russians? Why can't they control their border? Well, the Russians have an 1,100-mile border. That's pretty substantial. And it doesn't lend itself to walls and barbed wire because you have dense forests, massive rivers. So they can only protect so much. So inevitably, something's going to get through. But ultimately, the whole business failed. And I think that's why they subsequently, that is, the Russians, launched a strike against the secret police headquarters in Kiev. And that apparently was very devastating. And reportedly, there were large numbers of NATO officers also present in the headquarters when it was struck. I haven't seen any real confirmation that that is true. That's being alleged. by everybody on the ground over there. But again, we haven't seen any evidence in terms of bodies being removed and transported back to the United States, Great Britain, or other countries. So I think what the Russians have done now is they said, look, we know where everything is. And they do. They have the same overhead surveillance capability that we do. So that you can't hide from Russian military power in Ukraine. And the Russians have exercised, to this point, really remarkable restraint. They have not attacked cities, destroyed cities. They've only attacked weapon systems, particularly air defenses or weapon supply points, assembly areas, which in many cases were near or in cities, but they have not attacked cities. In other words, they have not done what we did during World War II, which is wholesale destroy Ukrainian cities. We destroyed Japanese and German cities. And Putin is held back deliberately because he wants to negotiate an end to this. And we keep insisting that there will be no negotiation, that he has to be driven out. Well, the possibility that the Ukrainians are going to drive the Russians out of Ukraine is about zero. So the real question is, what do the Russians do next? And I think they'll wait for this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, and then I think they'll strike. And I think we'll see their forces move. And they will complete the destruction of Ukrainian forces, certainly in eastern Ukraine. They will take Kharkov again and Odessa, which are historically Russian cities. And I imagine they'll probably close up on the Dnieper River, just as a matter of security. Now, what happens after that? Again, I think that Moscow would prefer to negotiate an end to this business. Whether or not we'll show up and do anything is unknown to me.
It says, according to CNBC just a few minutes ago, as we're recording, that drone strikes have continued to attack the Russian soil, including 2 oil refineries roughly 50 miles from Russia's highly important Black Sea oil export terminals. And so is that the counteroffensive that we're talking about here, or is there something else?
No, I think you're going to see some serious effort on the ground. The Ukrainians have brought about 30 to 35,000 soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, back from training areas in the United States, Germany, the Czech Republic, Canada. They are going to be assembled and become the backbone of a new counterattack force. Now, how large will it be beyond that? I don't know. But these are well-trained troops, and they're going to try and penetrate the Russian defenses in the south. I suspect that they will try at several points, but they will make an effort at one point because they just don't have that much striking power anymore on the ground. They can't afford to dissipate their forces. That is the Ukrainians. And I think it'll fail, but I think they feel obligated to try or face the possibility that more European states will desert them and no longer supply them. And after all, the Europeans have largely run out of equipment to send and ammunition to send. We're pretty close to that as well.
So do you think they're going to continue to go into Belgorod, that area they've been talking about? They've been making
I don't think they can go into it with any significant force. Everything that went in there was largely destroyed. All the troops were killed. I don't know how many times they can do that and lose everybody they send. That's been the biggest problem for the Ukrainians. I mean, this obsession with launching offensive operations has bled them dry. We're not sure how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been killed. We know that comparatively few Russians have been killed or wounded. I think the exchange rate has been, on the whole, about 1 to 8. One Russian for every 8 Ukrainians. And I think that's pretty standard. The issue is, if you're in Moscow right now and you're looking at the strategic picture in the West, it's becoming increasingly clear that you're going to have to launch an offensive in order to bring this to some sort of conclusion. Then hope that the Europeans will want to negotiate separately. And I think that the probability of that happening is growing with each passing day. Germany has now slipped into a very severe recession that could easily turn into a depression. Hundreds of thousands of Germans have lost their jobs in very important industries, chemical industries, anything that is petroleum based, obviously, heavy industry. Germany is really the engine of prosperity for the European Union. And as Germany sinks deeper and deeper into recession, more and more people lose their jobs, the impact on the rest of Europe is going to be profound. And once it becomes clear that the standard of living is falling dramatically, things are unaffordable or you can't get them, particularly food, then I think the people in charge are in a lot of trouble. So that's in the future. I can't predict when that will happen, but that's definitely going to happen. The question is, how long do the Russians wait? And I don't think they're going to wait very long. I think they're going to use the summer to try and wrap this up as much as they possibly can.
I thought, maybe I got this wrong, but I thought that they don't do stuff too much when the ground when it's warm, because the mud is so thick, you're not really taking.
No, that's true. But the ground is now solidifying in Ukraine. It's now hard enough to support the movement of large numbers of armored vehicles. That's for both sides, Ukrainians and Russians. Remember, the mud is agnostic. It cuts both ways. It stops Ukrainians, it stops Russians. That's why you've been watching these World War I style infantry battles, because you just could not move large maneuver forces. That's about to change. And I think the Ukrainians will open the summer with some sort of offensive. I don't think it'll work. I think they'll take terrible losses, and I think the Russians will then counterattack.
So is Russia going to have to go all the way to Kiev to get them to submit? Is that, I mean, in their calculation?
Well, I think that the probability of that being the case is growing with each passing day. Mm-hmm. Again, the Russians don't want to rule Ukrainians. I mean, Putin has said this several times. He's not interested in, quote unquote, conquering Ukraine, never was. All he wanted was neutrality for Ukraine. And what we did is we rejected neutrality in favor of this so-called NATO membership, but we had already spent 8 years from 2014 until 2022 building up this huge Ukrainian army, equipping it, training it, staffing it with the best officers and non-commissioned officers that we could find, and then preparing to launch it against the Russians. I think if the Russians had not attacked it, probably by the summer of 2022, you would probably have seen limited Ukrainian offensives against Russians in eastern Ukraine. Remember, all of this is about the fact that the Russian people in eastern Ukraine, and that's almost a third of the Ukrainian population that speak Russian, are culturally Russian, ethnically Russian, they were oppressed. They were treated as third-class citizens inside Ukraine. They were forced to either, quote-unquote, Ukrainianize or leave the country. So the Minsk agreements were designed to address this, but as we found out from Merkel and Macron in Europe, those agreements were a fraud. They were never serious. They were simply designed to buy time for the expansion and growth of Ukrainian military power. So now most of that military power is being destroyed. You have very few people with any experience that have survived combat and are capable left. That's why the return of these 30 to 35,000 from overseas is so important. So this is sort of the last gasp that I think the Ukrainians can manage on the ground. The Russians will dispatch it. And again, I think the Russians have figured out we're going to have to go to the river, to the Dnieper. We're going to have to turn south, take Odessa, turn north, take Kharkov. Those are the things that they were interested in to begin with, because that's where the Russians live. They don't really want to cross the river and try to manage or rule Western Ukraine. I mean, the Russians aren't stupid. They know that the Ukrainians don't want to be ruled from Moscow. But they feel compelled at this point to continue further simply because we've made it clear that whatever remains of Ukraine, we will transform into some sort of battering ram to be used against Russia. Russia's not going to accept that. The analogy would be if we discovered that the Chinese or the Russians or someone else was trying to transform Mexico into a platform for attack against the United States. Now, some people would say that's already happened with the drug cartels. That's another subject, and I agree that something we should be much more concerned about that than what's happening in Ukraine. But the point is, we would not tolerate foreign forces on the ground in Mexico building up an anti-American force. We would destroy it. Well, that's essentially what the Russians have done in Ukraine. But we don't want to rule Mexicans either. We want the Mexicans to govern themselves. And the Russians want the Ukrainians to govern themselves, but they want neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. And that condition is not going to change.
So how spent is Russia in terms of how many soldiers do they have? How many have they lost? How many are in the best quality to continue this type of war? Their economic and weapons situation. Where are they at? How spent are they in this whole?
Well, their economy is booming. They're doing land office business. Their exports, particularly of minerals and petroleum products, is at an all-time high. There is a meeting that will occur later this month in St. Petersburg involving 84 countries. And all of these countries are interested in what Russia and China are billing as gold-backed currency. All of these countries want to get out from under the U.S.-dominated financial system in the West. And the only way to do that is to go to, first and foremost, gold-backed currency trading. Now, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, obviously the Saudis and many of the Emirates have stockpiled an enormous quantity of gold. So they're ready to move in this direction. This would cut us out of the loop and essentially remove the burden of dealing with us through our system. This also means that they stop trading in dollars, which means we can't pass on our debt to them anymore, which is effectively what happens when they do business with us in dollars. Those 84 countries plus Russia, India, China, I think they have a very good chance of bringing this off. So that's the first thing. The point is that economically, we have not hurt Russia at all. Russia has boomed. Secondly, militarily, their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to produce military equipment of all types and kinds, everything from cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, all the way to tanks and aircraft and rifles. So there is no shortage of equipment. Lastly, manpower. Well, they right now have about 800,000+ in the Russian army, and that number continues to grow. There are certainly 700,000 either involved in the Ukrainian operation or serving in Russia in support of it. There are probably 300,000 to 400,000 Russian combat troops between Belarusia, up north, White Russia, and southern Ukraine ready to strike as needed. So they're in a very good position. But as I said at the beginning of this discussion, one of the things that is now being discussed behind the scenes in Moscow is the potential for total mobilization. If they go to a full mobilization force, then you're talking about 2 million men in the Russian army.
All coming into Ukraine, or not all coming in, right?
Well, you know, this all depends on us. I mean, they don't want to do these things, but if we are going to stand fast on our insistence that whatever remains of Ukraine has to be part of NATO, has to be hostile to Russia, has to host foreign forces, has to potentially host missile systems that we would put on the ground that threaten Russia, which was always on the agenda. As long as we insist upon that, the chances of the Russians going to full-blown mobilization are quite real. And that means that they'll move all the way to the Polish border, as well as to the Romanian border and the Moldovan border, once and for all. They just don't want a repetition of what they've just been through in Ukraine again. I mean, that's understandable. They don't want to go through this. But we, again, have refused to consider any alternative to what I just described. And it's unfortunate, David, because, you know, neutrality could have been an enormous bonanza for Ukraine. Neutrality is what Austria has enjoyed for decades. Austria's standard of living before it became neutral was far below Germany. Today, the standard of living in Austria is actually above Germany. In other words, Austria has profited economically enormously from neutrality. And I think Ukraine could have done that as well, and being a bridge of prosperity between East and West.
So who's calling the shots over there to keep it going? Zelensky, its government, his patrons, or United States, CIA? Is there different factions fighting over how to deal with this, or is it
all of the above? All of the above. Zelensky has always been sponsored by key figures in Washington, London, New York City.
Was it always a lie, basically, when he came into power on a position of trying to normalize relations with Russia? Was it always?
I think that's pretty clear. Yeah. And the thing that people should remember
reminds me of George W. Bush running as a humble
Yeah.
policy and turning into a warmonger.
No, that's right. I remember that Bush sitting across from McCain during the primary season. Everybody agreed that our intervention in Kosovo and Bosnia had been a mistake. How many R's
same
are there in
tactic
that
everywhere you
chant,
go.
right?
It's always the guy that runs as the anti-war guy that turns into the big belligerent John Bolton fan.
Yeah, well, I think Zelensky was always not who he appeared to be. Remember, Zelensky, strictly speaking, never spoke any Ukrainian. He only spoke Russian. That was his first language. And
how did their government have the audacity? If he only spoke Russian, but yet they were criminalizing people for saying good morning in Russian in the eastern side, how did they do that? How did they square that one?
Well, this is part of the reason he had so much support, though, because most people in Ukraine simply did not want Ukraine to be hostile to Russia. They didn't want a war. Mm-hmm. And he essentially said, if you elect me, I'll find a way forward. I'll negotiate peace with Putin. Now, it took him about 3 months to get to the point where he was fluent in Ukrainian and spoke it, largely accent free, although I'm told by many Russian and Ukrainian speakers that he continues to speak Ukrainian with a Russian accent. I don't know. The bottom line is, at this point, it's academic. Is he really interested in Ukraine? I find it hard to believe. I mean, he's sitting there with Larry Fink from BlackRock, and BlackRock is keenly interested in stripping all the resources it can from Ukraine and Russia, buying up all the property in Ukraine, ostensibly for future use by him and his co-investors. And this is something that Zelensky is willing to do. Doesn't sound like a Ukrainian nationalist to me. So I think. But
aren't the Ukrainian nationalists? Aren't there Ukrainian nationalists that are best fighters? What would be their morale in continually fighting for BlackRock at this point? I don't understand. If there's, I'm just trying to think strategically. If they're all into this, and they're saying, "Wait a second, we're doing this for BlackRock," and I thought we were all nationalistic or something.
Well, remember, David, that one of the advantages that the people spitting out the narrative of evil Russians who are committing atrocities and all this sort of business had the advantage of the Cold War behind us. I mean, for decades, people saw anybody who spoke Russian as potentially dangerous and certainly, if not evil, then certainly criminal in some way. Well, the Cold War ended, but this sort of picture of Russia lingered into the present. Mm-hmm. Now, today's Russia is not perfect. No society is, but it is certainly nothing at all like the Soviet Union. It is a Russian Orthodox Christian country. It is nationally based around Russian national identity, culture, and language. I think those are some of the reasons why the Western, what I call the oligarchs in the West, are so interested in destroying it. But the real underlying purpose is if they can bring down Russia, its government, if they can replace, say, Putin with someone like Zelensky, then ultimately you can gain access to all the resources that Russia has to offer. And Russia's resources are in abundance, and they would love to have access to that. So I think that's a legitimate concern for the Russians, and I think we need to understand that that's behind their thinking. Now, if you're Ukrainian, you're also a victim of your experience with the Soviet Union. Remember that you had somewhere between 6 and 9 million Ukrainians that were systematically starved, murdered, or transported to their deaths in the Gulag between 1929 and 1932 under Stalin. And the memory of the NKVD officers who came in there and did those things to the population has deep roots. So you're evoking these memories by appealing to Ukrainians to fight against the Russians, even though today's Russians bear no resemblance to the force that was communist and Soviet back in the 1930s. We even see these old descriptions lifted from histories of the Soviet armed forces during World War II that talk about the nature of the Soviet soldier, and they just strip out all the old language and they put in Russian soldier in the modern era, attributing the same attributes and the same behavior patterns to them that were there in 1933 to say 1945. It's not true, but again, how do you fight this underlying predisposition for people to believe the worst about your chosen enemy? It's very difficult to fight that, and I think that's worked to the advantage of the regime in Kiev. Now, having said that, if you look on Telegram and you look at the various channels and the various videos that are posted there, as long as they're up by Ukrainians and Ukrainian soldiers and officers, you discover that things are not good on the Ukrainian side at all. Large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers have begun to figure out that their lives are being squandered and wasted, and the people in Kiev are corrupt criminals. And there's open discussion about, well, if the Russians don't get there before us, we're going to get rid of Zelensky and his friends. I mean, I see that repeatedly on these Telegram channels. And there are lots and lots of videos of terrible atrocities committed by Ukrainian soldiers against the Russians. In fact, we had a German.
Is it ironically possible that if a nationalist group deposed Zelensky, that might be more willing to compromise with Russia at this point, or no?
It depends on how you define nationalists, but anybody who loves Ukraine at this point should be interested in saving it from total destruction. And right now, all the people coming out, we think there are as many as 12 or 13 million Ukrainians that have left. At least that many have all said on their way out, we're never going back. You're down to a population of somewhere around 19 million, 20 million, where you previously had 34.5. And remember, you go back to 1990, there were almost 90 million people living there. So there's been a steady drain because the population has grown tired of the corruption and the criminality. Ukraine has not been a nice place to live and grow up. People need to understand that, and they don't see any evidence that that's going to change under Zelensky or anybody like him.
It seems like there's predatory oligarchs that do not care at all about the local population, and they've learned how to exploit that local population's fears of being predated by foreign oligarchs to continue their abuse of these people. It's pretty sick.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable summary, David. I think you got it. It's very sad, and this is one of the reasons that President Trump said, I want the fighting to stop. I want the killing to stop. And that's what we should be concerned about. And the fact that we're not means that we're always in danger of overreaching and a direct confrontation with the Russians. And then you have people in Washington who don't want to be embarrassed by what could happen. And then there's the risk of escalation to the nuclear level. Not in Moscow. I fear it much more in Washington by this very amateurish and dangerous administration.
Well, it's certainly something that we're deeply concerned about, and everyone should be. And it would not be probably a good time to be leveraging yourself too much into accumulating dollars for investing when we're going to have all these rocky things happening to the dollar. It's a very scary time for the middle class in America, and they'll be the ones that take the pain for BlackRock's profits in this exploitation of the dollar to try to gather more resources.
I think you're absolutely on target, and Americans should be demanding that the focus should be at home. We need to restore the rule of law. We need to directly combat and eradicate criminality in all of our major cities. We need to close the border. We need to stop the human trafficking as well as the drug trafficking where it starts, comes out of Mexico and travels north. Close the border and stop it. How many lives did we lose last year to fentanyl? And we keep talking about fentanyl. That's just one drug. Well, we think we lost another 100,000 human beings, another 100,000 Americans. No one seems to raise that issue in Washington, D.C. for any length of time.
So true. What did you talk about the Orthodox Church in Russia? What did you make of Zelensky giving an icon to the Pope with Jesus blacked out of it, the baby Jesus? Did you see that?
I didn't see that. I wouldn't pay any attention to what he does and the people around him. I'm sure you saw a photograph of him with, I think it was von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Union Commission. Zelensky was in the center. Somebody else was on his right, and it was in front of a sculpture of a hermaphrodite. A hermaphrodite it looks like an angel, but it has male genitalia and female breasts and so forth. And they were photographed in front of this as though this were the future, and everybody get on board. I mean, this is all depraved stuff. Yeah. And I'm afraid the elites have signed on for it in Europe and the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, it's disgusting. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I thank you again for sharing your assessment of things over there, and hope we'll continue to pray for peace and a quick resolution to this.
Well, I hope everybody calls their congressman and senator and demands an end to this. That's what has to happen. I'm all for prayer, but we need to send the signal clearly. We want this to end. And the troops in Poland and Romania that we have over there, 40 or 50,000 or more, they need to be on the border. Not Europe.
I just had an idea. I heard Tucker Carlson might want to do a GOP debate. I wish he could have you up there in the panel asking the questions of those. Could you imagine that? Colonel MacGregor, what was your question for the candidates? That'd be great to hear him get some actual foreign policy questions for once.
Well, I suspect that'll be a cold day in hell, David, but we'll see.